You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Saw the
games,
physical
and I
basketball
was at the games.
versus
You were
physical
not.
fouling.
You watched them on YouTube.
Anyway.
I saw the games. I watched the games.
Well, we're here. I'm Bob Moats. Welcome to X's and Joe's, a podcast dedicated to decoding the winning formula in college basketball.
And I'm Mike Wiemuth. Welcoming you to episode 4, Discovering the Sweet Spot, How a National Championship Winning Trend Was Exposed. So, Bob, in about 48 hours, we'll be sharing drinks and smokes together in Bloomington.
Been a long time coming. I think the last time we did this, it was about a decade ago. Tom Crean was still coaching, and
that's right.
We were, and my wife and I were still relative newlyweds, to be honest. I think it was the first time you met her, actually.
I believe so. Yeah, that's right.
So,
oh, that is cool.
So we get a chance to go back to the sacred grounds and pal around on Kirkwood for another evening or two and do what we do, and looking forward to seeing not just the Back Home Network crew, but a lot of the fans of Assembly Call and maybe also X's and Joe's doing the work, Crimson Cast, and we get a chance to meet some new friends.
Yeah, no, it'll be cool. Yeah, I did. I logged on last night to Assembly Call in the post game, and I guess I learned that our rookie hazing rituals will actually commence this weekend. Is that correct?
So, this is why I needed more adult supervision, honestly, and that's why you do the negotiating in our deals, not me necessarily. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying, hey, part of our job might just be helping some people get back to the hotels if that's an issue. Directions, concierge services. Yeah. Was not expecting to hear the words credit card, but and again, they're talking to me here. Like I walk into Nick's and they're asking me to go to the ATM because they want cash. It's like, no.
It's like, Moats is here.
Moats is here. We've been burned before. Do not take a check. Do not take a personal money order. Whatever you do not take an IOU. Yeah. In fact, they're going back through the years of, you still have a bar tab from 1997.
Exactly. Yeah, the president did get free drinks back then, unfortunately. So.
No. Especially when certain people walked out.
Yeah. I'm just glad that Nick's, that they don't carry brands like Cristal, so that we could we'd be exposed to like a 4 or 5 digit bill on our way out of town. So
no. I mean, I can't use that tax write-off till next year.
Exactly.
That's what sucks.
I suppose it is a little bit more dignified, at least, than wearing like a Hello Kitty backpack like, Damian Lillard had to.
This is how it starts. Don't give them any ideas. Do not give them any ideas.
Yeah. Let's maybe hope that this doesn't post before then. So
Phillips is out there right now. Yeah, he hears this. He's stopping at the airport gift shop to pick us up some Bluey stuff or something, and at least you give that to my kid.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, but it's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it, and like you said, meeting everyone is going to be a really good time, I think.
And always good to spend time in Bloomington with my old friend. So
exactly,
looking forward to that as well.
Yep.
So all of this, in no small part, is because of the wonderful sponsorship of our friends at Home Field Apparel, and big supporters of the Back Home Network. And we're big fans. Obviously, we talk about them every show. And I mean, we checking it out today. We're at the end of winter, so you start thinking about spring wear, but you also start thinking about sometimes it's just nice finding a nice jacket that can work for times during the winter and even the spring. I'm looking at their bomber jackets going, they're sharp, they're definitely good statement pieces. And like everything from Home Field, high quality clothing that can get you, that can do that just looks good. Yeah. But it was just, but I'm, with Valentine's Day coming up, also noticed they dropped a couple new lines.
I saw that too. Yeah.
So like, if your significant other is a fan of, let's say, the University of Kentucky or Arkansas, you can definitely get those, as well as we heard some rumors about maybe IU.
Maybe IU. Yeah, I did see. I saw that on the Twitters at some point this week.
something might be amiss there too. So, for your significant other, or if she's struggling to find what to get you, or he's struggling to find what you get you, you can definitely point him out to homefieldapparel.com or homefieldapparel.com. And there's another new line they dropped, Mike. Another one with an IU connection. Did you see that?
No, I'm trying to guess. Wait a minute, is it Nevada?
Nevada. So they had Nevada.
I did see that. Yeah.
Some sharp Wolfpack stuff coming in. So
that is. I do like their colors. They are pretty cool.
The colors are pretty cool, yes, and it's and definitely one that you can wear around the state of Indiana and be a great conversation starter, or just about anywhere where you found IU fans.
Yeah, the further on the eastern border towards Ohio, you definitely wear that kind of stuff around there. So
especially
right along I-70. Yeah,
right along I-70. Maybe make a stop at the Indiana Hall of Fame, Basketball Hall of Fame.
Yep.
You might get free admission. I'm not saying no, you will not get free admission, but they at the very least would be, you could definitely at least get a conversation over with the volunteer at the front would be more than happy to talk to you about it. So let's go ahead and get started.
Great. Segment 1. Let's talk about the sweet spot. Oh, let's see. So for this one, I'd say maybe we'll give a little bit of fair warning for this one. This episode will be a little bit more slide heavy than most of the other ones that we've done. So we'll try to not make it some kind of like John Houseman paper chase lecture. We'll try to make this more of a slow walkthrough of the materials and try to give people a sense of where these concepts actually came from. As always, we'll post the slides in the show notes afterwards so that our audio-only listeners can review at their leisure. I would definitely encourage that for this episode, as a lot of this stuff is, or at least makes more sense if you see the charts visually for yourself. So I would definitely encourage people to go jump on backhomenetwork.com and just look under podcast X's and Joe's, and you'll find the show notes for episode 4. So jumping in, let's see where to begin. If we roll back the time machine back to our chat from episode 1, I spoke about the time I spent in the 90s and early 2000s digging into the ranking analytics on how recruiting rankings and winning related to each other. And back then I found that basketball and football were actually pretty well aligned in terms of how the rankings and winnings were relating. Elite programs in basketball like Kentucky, Duke, North Carolina, they chased after top 30 recruits and won their fair share of titles at that time. Pretty much like the football powers at that same time were doing exactly the same thing, right? FSU, USC, Florida, they were chasing 5-star recruits in football and winning also their fair share of championships. So I guess a simple way to put it, contrasting that period and what we're going to be talking about in this episode, is that in those days, recruiting the very elite basketball players, like the top 30 players, did not impose any cost on you for winning national championships. Just like football, again, chasing the best players generally made you best positioned for winning championships in basketball. So in terms of the programs at that time, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a little bit of a stable split between squads that were loaded with like top 30 recruits like Duke, Carolina, Kentucky. There's also a bit of a secondary track at that time where teams were actually winning championships with some mix of top end kids, but also some, let's say, like not quite as elite, but more experienced players. So you think of like the team that actually beat Indiana in the championship in 2002, like Maryland, with that squad with Dixon and Blake and those guys. And then also the Florida teams of like the middle 2000s with, Billy Donovan's like back-to-back championships. So with that split, I hadn't actually coined the term sweet spot at that time. That was a concept that was not really like on my radar at that point. I just noted back then that there seemed to be two sort of like differentiated ways in which teams were going about winning championships, like just like the stud heavy one, and then the ones that was a little bit more of a mix of studs and more experienced players. So I'll jump and show us some slides here. What you see here is the kind of stuff I was actually studying at that time back in the 90s and 2000s. Probably the two most common things I was looking at was the number of NBA players on teams. And also, and I'll show you in the second slide, also was looking at, let's say, top 100 recruits per team. So I was just taking basic counts of each roster, trying to gauge, like, okay, how many NBA dudes are on this squad versus, how many top 100 players are also in the squad. So I was kind of keeping counts and doing a lot of like comparison between those counts and like how those teams were faring. Were they going to national championships? Were they going to Sweet 16s? Were they bailing out at the round of 32? Were they winning conference championships? Were they winning, 24, 27, 30 games? So just doing a lot of that sort of comparison study at that time. And of course, you remember, Bob, I was like, especially in the 90s, I was like running up to your office and like, bringing you these reams of sheets to review.
Show and right. Well, and some of this also, when you talk about the NBA players on title teams, there was a mythology that you didn't necessarily have to have NBA style type talent to be highly competitive in college basketball. Mm-hmm. And in reality, you could, theoretically win a national title, much like IU did in '87 with very limited NBA capabilities.
Yeah.
And as you kind of delved into this more and we talked about it more and things began to crystallize 90s with Kentucky, even the teams, Arkansas, Duke's rise during that time. Mm-hmm. You may not have had a team. And when we talk about NBA players, we're not talking necessarily about guys that are NBA All-Stars, or even the best player on their team. These are guys who just make it to the league, which is kind of the elite of the elite of the elite.
Yeah. And
maybe they're not sticking there for more than a couple seasons or even a season, but they still made the league. They made the show.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it was just interesting, when we were kind of running this stuff, you kind of saw this variation that was kind of running. I mean, there would be some years where, as you can see here, you would have like UConn and UNC, 6 NBA dudes. And then the year prior, Syracuse had 2. But of course, like you said, sometimes certain NBA guys might be more valuable than others. And that Syracuse team obviously benefited from that particular stipulation.
Carmelo Anthony, and this was, again, when we started talking more about the one and done.
Yeah.
That was a great example. There were there were examples, but I mean, that was the one where Syracuse and Jim Boeheim wins one national title in his career.
Yeah.
And that happens to be with Milo taking on a great deal of, as a freshman, high productivity.
Yeah.
And just a high level of responsibility and leadership that he kind of has shown throughout U.S. Olympic teams and on NBA teams as well.
Yeah.
But that was and working in that zone that they ran, and that was really, I think, a big thing in that time. And around the same time frame, Kevin Durant was playing in Texas.
Yeah, exactly.
And he got, again, Rick Barnes to a Final Four.
Yeah.
With his teammates, obviously. But again, another example of here's a one and done who can do some damage. And it was kind of like that idea of the blended track where, you had some really good pieces around them.
Yeah.
But that one and done player, that one highly talented, highly skilled player who are going to be NBA Hall of Famers.
Yeah.
They come in and they're able to kind of just pull it all together and get those guys around him. Similar to what Larry Bird did at Indiana State in '79.
Yeah.
Similar to Oscar Robertson at Cincinnati in the '60s. I mean, we could go down the list of team after team after team that had that kind of superstar, that one guy that just kind of made them or broke them.
Yeah.
And those systems were able to work that way.
Exactly. And and you notice, like, the number of NBA dudes and also top 100 recruits, also generally sort of correlated. So yeah, it was interesting running those numbers at that time. That that was like really when I was first sort of like getting into this kind of stuff, and it was like the first time you actually started to see some variations because again, basketball's changing every 5-10 years. There'd just be these big like waves that come through. And so I remember like thinking when I first started this back in, let's say 97, 98, it's like, oh, well, this is the way it's going to be. And then you start seeing these little waves come in that, shift everything. And all of a sudden I thought, okay, well, did all my data wrong before, or do I just have to be a little bit more adaptive? And so I did have to learn a lesson right around the time when the one and done started coming through that, okay, you just have to be a little bit flexible and allow a little bit of shifting in your analysis.
Well, and again, again, when you look at this, I mean, again, when we talk, oftentimes when we go retrospective, we're doing autopsies where, the body's dead.
Yeah.
So we kind of figure out what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And we can somewhat give some projections moving forward as to it can go here, it can go here, it can go here.
Yeah.
One of the big elements of this was when you look at those Florida teams and you look at who they beat that second year at Ohio State.
Yeah.
Or as we like to call it in Indiana, that sort of the guys that got the guy that got away. The guys that got away.
The two guys that got away.
Right, Conley and Oden, who and I think at that point, Mata coming in and getting those two to come to his school, getting them to and those two with their teammates again propelled them to a final game. Mm-hmm. But it was kind of a precursor what we're going to look at and talk about, which was you had again a blended 2 one and dones blending with the rest of a team. And they came pretty close to securing a national championship for a program that hadn't really that has been incredibly competitive, but has not been able to get over that hump into those final games.
Exactly. Yeah, and I guess that was a big shift. I always say that 2005 was like the monkey wrench in the system. It was the 2005 collective bargaining agreement where they stipulated the one and done. And just so we're defining terms here, the one and done rule at that time passed saying that players had to be 19 years old and 1 year removed from their high school graduation to be eligible for the NBA draft. So before then, they got the guys like Kobe Bryant and Dwight Howard, LeBron James. Those guys could jump straight to the NBA without going to college. And then 2005, that all changed.
Kevin Garnett was another.
Yeah.
Moses Malone back in the 70s. And I mean, when it was more of a Wild West with the ABA. I mean, when we talk about one and dones, we just lost recently one of the greatest one and dones in Indiana, and really throughout basketball, also in Indiana history, and George McGinnis.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a thought of, why should we have to stay in college when our families, and in George's case, his family needed money and he needed to provide.
Yeah.
And
that was before the NIL was available.
Well before and
unless you went to certain other schools where they had a version of NIL.
And Indiana got in a little bit of trouble with that in the 60s, and they kind of had to shut that down in football, back in those. So that's a whole different conversation, but
that'll be an episode like 14 or so.
14. Yeah. It's like NIL and its weird history.
Yeah.
But back to that point, I guess where you're kind of looking at this, which is, that collective bargaining agreement and the idea that, and it also kind of shifts your top 100, by the way, because now you're adding 10 guys or so every year that had not really been a part of it into the collegiate rankings.
Yeah, exactly.
And that everything kind of just shifts down. So if you were 35, you're more than likely going to be 45 after that CBA. Yeah.
And also the offer rate, how programs offer and sort of like the totem pole of offers changes. Now you're like dumping all these kids in, and now, okay, it used to be like picking up off, if you're like Krzyzewski, maybe you're offering kids down here now that one and done's come, or whoever is at the top of the totem pole of coaches are now going to like move up. And so, okay, do other coaches move up behind them? So it was a big shift, and it was like interesting how how different programs approached that change, compared to the way they used to operate.
Well, and I'd also add another factor to this conversation, which was that's around the same time when you had a seismic shift in who was coaching whom.
Right.
And it started, there was this weird little sequencing that started when Matt Doherty struck out at UNC. Dean calls, gets Roy to come to UNC. I believe it was around, I think it was was it 04?
04, yeah.
And then Roy gets that Doherty class, which is, again, Sean May's class. I think that was the class we're talking about here.
Yeah, McCants, yeah, all those kids. Yeah.
But it goes from, there's Roy with that group. Well, Roy leaves Kansas. Well, Kansas needs somebody new. So they go in and they bring in Bill Self. They get him from Illinois. He moves to Kansas. Bill's still there. Illinois is out of a coach. They look up and they think, okay, well, down in Southern Illinois, there's this guy, Bruce Weber, who looks like he knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
And was the heir apparent at Purdue, by the way.
Oh, yeah,
that was always the word. The rumor was Bruce Weber's going to go, and he's going to Sweet 16s. He's bringing the right guys in. Weber then gets ascended to Illinois, where he actually takes him to a final game. I believe he did that against Carolina in 05.
Yeah.
And then Matt Painter takes over at Southern Illinois, spends a year there, and then Purdue realizes we don't want to we could be off the merry-go-round fast.
Yeah.
Mata moves over to Ohio State around the same time frame. You start noticing, and Jay Wright, I think, was kind of coming in. It was around that same time frame also for Villanova. Yeah. So a whole new generation, like there was a large seismic shift.
Yeah.
And all these guys are trying to figure out, what can we do differently? What can we bring into these programs? How can we solidify or take that step up?
Yeah. And all those ones you mentioned, the funny thing is that when it comes to one and dones, that wasn't even the biggest seismic shift, even almost collectively amongst those guys. The biggest one was 09 when Kentucky brings in Calipari. And that's, we can take if we jump over to our slide here.
So, I mean, you got to kind of set the scene a little bit on this, that, Pitino leaves after the 97 season to go coach the Boston Celtics. Tubby takes over, wins the national title going in the next year, spends a few years in Kentucky doing decently. I mean, very similar to, I think, Joby Hall, very similar to Eddie Sutton type results. Yeah. But after Pitino and after kind of the shutdown phase, the UK fan base wanted something more. They wanted something different. They tried the hot young coach approach with Billy Gillespie. He lasted 2 years. And at that point, UK was at a crossroads.
Yeah.
You had to go entirely different. And I think that they had a short list of probably two. One would have been Billy Donovan to try to wrestle him away from Florida, which wasn't happening.
Yeah.
And the second one was to go find John Calipari out of Memphis.
Yeah.
They get Cal. Cal brings in that Wall class.
Yeah.
But the other thing was 2009, he goes on the floor of Rupp Arena, and you may have to Google the name John Young Brown, but he gave the John Young Brown acceptance speech that he always wanted to give, the campaign rally speech in the middle of Rupp Arena, 15 minutes with a teleprompter, the most famous speech ever given in the state of Kentucky, except for Alvin Barkley's last one. And it's only because he died after after he gave it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, when you think about the top, they may be studying in schools in 50 years, the Calipari speech, and he gets up there amongst Big Blue Nation. It's Big Blue Madness. They're big thing. Midnight Madness. He's got the place packed, celebrities. I don't think Ashley Judd was there, but she might have been. Yeah. I mean, it was close. And he gets up and basically sets up the Calipari Doctrine and says, if I have a choice between talent and experience, I'm taking talent every single time.
Yeah.
And he, at that point, said, I just lost at Memphis with a team that was really good. They were good players. But I'm at Kentucky, and we have the best horses. We have the best bourbon. We better have the best basketball players.
Yeah.
And we're going to hold them to a high standard. And, I mean, he talked about the privilege of the state of, I mean, it's a well-crafted speech. I mean, whoever wrote the thing for him, if it was him, whoever helped him write that thing could do an inaugural.
The family thing, right?
Exactly.
Part of the theme of the family.
And we're going to get these guys in here and we're going to win. And he basically said, every year we're going to compete for a national title.
Yeah.
That was the vision. That was the doctrine. And he wasted no time in doing it because he had a team kind of waiting in the wings, ready to go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting, we talk about, just how quickly he jumped in with both feet on going after one and dones. I mean, 2010 was his first official recruiting class, against Wall, Cousins, Orton, and Bledsoe. So he had 4 right off the bat. And then we compare that, and everyone knows today that, that Duke is obviously a one and done school as well. I think I did a count the other day. Kentucky, I believe, has 31 one and dones in the Calipari era. And I believe Duke is about at 28. So, I mean, they've been pretty much neck and neck for a while. But Kentucky actually jumped out to kind of a sizable lead in that count when Calipari was hired. I don't think, Duke didn't have, for the 5 years prior from the collective bargaining agreement up to 2010, 11, they didn't have any one and dones, I believe. So, you see in this slide, by the time you get through to, 2010, by itself, Calipari had 4, and it took, from 2010 to 2014, Krzyzewski only took 2. So you see, Krzyzewski was actually kind of slow playing his one and done. Obviously, he had availability of those kind of players, but obviously he was still focused on a much more, let's say, senior laden type of roster that he was used to at Duke and throughout the 90s.
Well, and when you bring up Coach K and what he was kind of doing at this time in a parallel track. Around the same time as the CBA, there was also the conversation around USA basketball. 2004, they lose. They get a bronze medal, which was in the 12 years after the Dream Team was almost what really kind of pointed to something being really wrong with what we were doing to field an international team. Won't even talk about the 2002 Worlds in Indianapolis, and you go in and they make a change by bringing Mike Krzyzewski in to coach them for the 08 Olympics, using the 2006 World Championships as and the idea was to create basically a central team and then coach them through. But he's learning, first off, how do you coach pros? And Krzyzewski has even said, he shows a practice schedule to these guys on this 06-08 group, and they're like, this is not what we do. Yeah. We need time to do our individual workouts. We need time to do our yoga. You've not built in enough sleep for us. What's our diet look like? And Krzyzewski's going, what are these guys talking about?
Yeah.
And he dawned on him that he needed to kind of shift in what he was doing. And as he began to coach those guys, I think he gained in confidence in what he could do with guys in short coaching situations.
Yeah.
Calipari running dribble drive offense, and knowing that in the defensive end, he could teach them how to play defense in a certain way that could ensure that schematically they're not going to do anything incredibly spectacular. You just got to get guys in the right places and let them create the score.
Yeah.
And both of them kind of had systems and coaching methodologies, unlike a Wisconsin where you're trying to teach, if you're Bo Ryan, swing offense and pack line defense.
Yeah.
Or even Carolina sometimes where, they may be running multiple offenses and defenses and trying to do different things on the floor at any given time.
Yeah.
They felt like they could just create schematics that could work.
Yeah.
And the other thing is you look at their 2 one and dones and Kyrie Irving and Austin Rivers, and those were, again, any program in the country would have wanted to get them.
Yeah.
And I think in Austin Rivers' case, it was like Doc Rivers said, there's only 2 or 3 guys I'd let me coach my kid, and Mike Krzyzewski's one of them.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, it was interesting. You think back, I always say that 2012 Kentucky team seemed to, I think it almost set the table for what you saw throughout the last like 10, 12 years, because you remember Kentucky wins the championship that year. That's the Anthony Davis, Michael Kidd Gilchrist, Teague, that loaded team, the team that Christian Watford beat on the Watt shot. That team won the title. That was the same year Coach K lost to Lehigh in the same bracket as Kentucky in the first round. So, and then eventually, like after that, you notice that obviously because the following class was already, basically spoken for. I remember at that time, like seeing like Duke's offers start to spike in sort of that like one and done sector compared to what they had done before. So maybe what you said, something between his international experience may have tipped a little bit towards some favorability towards some one and done kids. Also, maybe they're just like a FOMO kind of thing that taken place. I mean, you literally just saw like anyone who saw Anthony Davis perform in the tournament that year understood that, okay, this is like having Patrick Ewing on your team. I mean, this kid is just dominant. Like you can barely, Louisville could barely have any offense within like 10 feet of the basket. They're just like, throwing like floaters all day way over his head to not much effect. So yeah, so I think that's a good, it sort of sets the table for what you saw coming thereafter. And obviously after Duke did start loading up, they won the championship in 2015 with Okafor, Jones, and Winslow. So 3 one and dones on that squad. So
and it also, the one and dones are part of the story. That doesn't mean that these guys aren't out getting the rest of the 5 stars.
Yeah,
that there were 5 stars that were sticking around an extra year. Rarely, occasionally 2.
Yeah.
Like that 2015 team, I believe, had JJ Redick on it, didn't it?
No, that would have been I think it was an earlier team. If you're talking about 2015, it would have been, I think that was like maybe Cook, I think, was on that team. Okay. So, yeah.
Yeah,
but they did have, I think they at least had one shooter on there.
They still had some great pieces there. And it was also, so what you're doing is you're taking 25 players that are 5 stars. Mm-hmm. And what would you say? In between a third and a half of them are going to want to basically going to 2 programs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so now the question is economics of, do I fight? Do I go up against these guys and fight them?
Yeah.
Do I look for guys that they don't want out of the 5-star area and go get those guys and spend the resources on it? Or do I look to find another way? Do I need to innovate, and then knowing that I can develop talent or get these guys playing together better? And we looked at the production curve last time, and we'll talk about it a little later, but can we get these guys to a level by the time they're juniors and seniors where they're going to be a contending team?
Exactly.
And so now that blended track starts, I guess, going into those 2 that we're talking about.
Exactly. I think that sets the stage pretty well for what we'll talk about, especially when we get into segment 3. So, So at least for now, when we come back, we'll take a peek at some familiar programs and examine how they fared in this early one and done period. Next on X's and Joe's.
Well, welcome back. We're going to talk about some, again, really 3 programs and throw a couple others in to kind of just add some flavor, but some programs around that era that were doing some very interesting, distinct, interesting things while trying to compete with what was happening across the board in the game, and doing each one, I think, doing it a little differently. And they were more of a blended track teams in some respects. At least one of them was definitely what you would call a blended track. But each one of them kind of had their ups and downs during that time frame. So I think when you look at that 2010, 2011 seasons, you look at Butler in particular as being a program that kind of shot a gap. And around the same time, UConn, Duke, they were still, again, UConn was won almost every couple of years in this time frame, running kind of a blended track approach. But Butler found a way out of a low, at that point, the Horizon it was a low major conference, winning tons and tons of games and figuring out that they could compete on a national level with the players they had with a stylistic, systemic way of playing. Yeah. Having Brad Stevens as your head coach helps.
Yeah, but even once in a generation coaches aren't bad to have.
But you're talking about a program before that implementing the Butler way, with guys like Darnell Archie, a great example of a player that was at that time frame. Yeah. Before then, Arch was doing some amazing, they were able to do things like go to Sweet 16s, for example, and be competitive against some of the best teams in the country in a 6-game tournament format. Doing a lot of, and you throw the magic of a Brad Stevens in with a player like Gordon Hayward and really learning kind of innovation from an offensive standpoint of we can run almost a version of continuity ball screen offense. Mm-hmm. That if we space the floor with shooters, we have Matt Howard as our big. Eventually, Austin Smith kind of fit into that category as well. Mm-hmm. And we can also run Hayward on Sheldon Mack off of a ball screen. We have Hahn sitting in the corner ready for a kick out 3. We have a system that's really hard for teams to defend against because we can score at such a high. We could score with them at a high level, and they were defensively good enough that they could prevent teams from just getting on those crippling types of runs.
Yeah.
And again, they came within a half court rim out of a national championship against Duke.
Yeah.
Ran into a little bit more of a buzz cut against UConn, but that was a close game up until maybe the last 4 to 6 minutes of the game when UConn just got their separation.
Yeah.
But again, teams like Butler, and then, around that same time with Shaka Smart running havoc defense at VCU.
Yeah.
They make a Final Four around that. In I believe it was 2011, they make the Final Four.
Yeah.
And they're running a high energy trapping style defense, a lot of length, a lot of athleticism. Like we talked about Kelvin Sampson's program last time.
Yeah. It's interesting, those kind of coaches, those that have a particularized type of style that almost, I'll say, defies sort of the conventional wisdom about the kind of recruits you have to have and all that. But I mean, they're definitely a little bit outliers in a certain sense, that you can't just like take, the rankings and what you see there, like win output, and like try to like make, some kind of correlation, because they really are kind of like almost like outside of the typical, correlation slope, let's say.
And you're talking about 1 game samples here. And so many variables happen in a 1 game. I mean, and we're seeing with more frequency 2 seeds beating 15 seeds.
Yeah.
Was it, we remember when Arizona lost that back in the 90s, and it was almost like, the tectonic plates had shifted.
Yeah.
There's no way. And now we've seen a couple 1 seeds go down to 16s. Yeah. Because you have not just systems, but you also have players getting better and better and better across the board.
Yeah.
No one really stinks anymore. So those teams were able to kind of build those. Greg Marshall at Wichita State, similar thing as well, where he, again, mid-major program at Wichita State, gets them to a Final Four, nationally competitive, so much so that he actually got the 1 seed the next year after he makes the Final Four. I think it was that 2013 he makes the Final Four. 2014 he gets the 1 seed, loses to an 8 seed Kentucky, who then goes all the way to the final game and almost wins it.
Yeah.
And so the mid-major breakthroughs in this time frame are kind of, I think, also kind of showing some innovations, showing some different ways of doing things, showing the value of getting guys to play together in a certain way.
Yeah. Yeah. And think about a lot of those coaches at that time, like how hot they became, like on the open market. Remember, like when I had the opening, like, people are talking about Marshall taking that. And Shaka, of course, was like, like the number 1 offer, I think, for at least like 2 years straight.
One thing one
trying
great
to
thing,
remember like when he got the Texas job, how much of an interval between that and his
it was a few
his run.
years,
Yeah,
but he had his pick of the litter.
Yeah, he did.
And Texas was a good situation, and it just again sometimes things just don't work out. And he was one tournament away from an extension. Would you say one tournament game away from an extension during the COVID year?
Probably.
I will say this much about Shaka Smart. I mean, it must have been 7 or 8 years ago, and my assistant coach Mike Janikowski, who's coaching a program, building his own women's program, I think in D3 up in Michigan. Mm-hmm. He developed a lot of relationships with coaches, and he basically sent out kind of an all points bulletin to the guys. And Shaka wrote him back to give a message to our team going in as serious underdogs. Shaka is great at building relationships, and you find with the great ones, that's what they do. They build relationships, but and they do it through coaching. If there's nobody, on their way up, they remember that there's guys also trying to move up in the profession, like Mike was and is still, and doing a heck of a job, I might add. Shaka's doing some great things now where he's, he'll say, look, I'm going to show my support here because these guys are trying to do something and I can help, I can contribute. Yeah. And that's the sort of thing. Again, you kind of look at the mid majors, we guys that rise up in those areas. I mean, Brad Stevens ends up coaching the Boston Celtics. Mm-hmm. Now he's a general manager. Granted, he likes his Dunkin' Donuts. We have them in Indiana, but I understand completely why he wants. Yeah, that too. And he may just like the traffic more, but I understand why Brad. He's found his place in the NBA. That being said, that was one grouping, and then at the same time, we talked about Matt Painter a minute ago, getting the Purdue job. Yeah. Pretty much mid 2000s. And it was kind of a weird transition because Gene Cady wasn't winning. They were sub 500 for a couple of seasons under him. Mm-hmm. And they realized that Painter had 1 year at SIU, used Weber's recruits, got, I think, again to another Sweet 16, and Purdue said, if we don't get this guy now, we're going to lose him. Yeah. And they already had like lists of guys, that over the years that either got out of the game on the high college level for a variety of reasons, or in the case of Weber, found better jobs. So they decided to put him under a 1 year to almost tutelage of Cady for a year. Yeah, it's like a provisional contract, it felt like. And then Gene passed it over to him, literally passed the baton to him. Painter struggled for a year or two, but then he goes and he lands the Baby Boilers. Yeah. A really good, again, high-level recruit, kind of those mid, I would say kind of what we would call, we'll talk about them being sweet spot guys. It was Robbie Hummel. It was Etuan Moore. It was Jawan Johnson. Yeah. Scott Martin before he left. Right. Yeah. Forgot about him. Yeah. All those guys were between, I think like Moore was the highest rating. He's like 23. And I think Hummel was, Hummel was like the lowest. I think he was 61. But yeah, they're all between like, 20, I think it was 20, 47, 43, and 61, I think was their count off. And like the Purdue teams that we grew up not enjoying watch play. I mean, they're fun to watch. We're not fans. Yeah. But at the same time, you had to respect them, and that was the days when and it kind of brought Purdue back into that area because IU was beating them regularly in that era. Yeah. And now with bringing those guys in, and then also bringing in other skilled dudes that could do one or two things really well and be good teammates around this base of three players. Yeah. You really kind of notice that Painter was building something there. And so you look at the win lines and you see, like we have a slide up with winning with these schools and their wins. And you'll notice that, Butler, surges those, 09 and 2010, bit of a regression, little bit of a return after Painter in 2013. After Stevens leaves. But you also have the same thing with Purdue where those Baby Boilers were 25-win teams. Yeah. And then he kind of and he'll talk about how he shifted his recruiting focus to look for more talented players.
Yeah, that was that odd. I think I've told you this before. Is like, let's call that that period after the baby boilers left was their Blazing Saddles Rock Ridge period, where it seemed like the whole roster had the last name Johnson.
Yeah.
So yeah, and of course, nothing seemed to work on that roster. It was like, Anthony Johnson, Ronnie Johnson, Tyrone Johnson passing the ball around. And, it usually ends up with Tyrone Johnson shooting a floater in the lane. That was like most of their offense.
And I mean, at that point, Painter's a motion guy. And so he starts reevaluating. He also, when bringing in A.J. Hammonds, who eventually became a decent college player. But I remember a story from his freshman year where Hammonds they left him at the hotel on the team. Yeah. The team bus left him.
You told me that one. I remember.
The team bus leaves A.J. Hammonds because he's like, kid's late. He's got to learn a lesson. We got to go.
He's a hard kid to miss.
He really is. It was like, well, gee, coach, I lost my socks. It's like whatever the excuse was. And, and so then as they've gone through those years where, again, they go back to that 500 level, the regression kind of goes a couple of years and you start asking, is the Painter thing real?
Yeah.
Then he found, again, the Dakota Mathiases, the Carson Edwards, the Isaac Haas's, those Travion Williams eventually kind of into this as we see this rise up that leads to what we're seeing today. Yeah. That's sort of when we talk about roster construction, how they're kind of the ultimate island of misfit toys. Mm-hmm. But he also, again, kind of got himself out of coaching offense.
Yeah.
He looked at the big picture of offense and left the details to a coordinator.
Yeah.
He made adjustments to his defensive schemes. He became much more flexible as a coach so he could be successful, knowing the types of players that he's really targeting.
Yeah. I'd always heard that I always heard that Painter really hated that period of time, Not just from the the wins and losses, but he just did not. He really loved the baby boilers, and he really loved like going into that Matthias, Haas, team that, and eventually like Carson Edwards, popped in there too. So it's, that weird intermediary period was just, it was just really,
well,
seems so out of sorts of like what you think of a Painter team. Right.
And really it's one of those things from a coaching standpoint. Sometimes you get teams where everything looks so good on paper. And you see him, and you see him for the first couple times going, man, they could really be something. And it just doesn't come together. Yeah. And so you really have two choices, I think, as a coach, kind of the path divergence, where you can stay path dependent, where you just keep going.
Yeah.
I'm going to bust this through their heads. Or you look at the whole thing and you kind of go more flexible, but you also look at how you're doing things. Am I getting the right dudes? Am I getting them to? Am I structuring things in a way that's indicative of the kids that I've got? And am I working through that? And to Painter's credit, he kind of surrendered his ego at the door and made the adjustments.
Yeah.
And really for him, it was just going back to I want guys who are going to play my way, and we're going to go with that. And I'm going to find guys that have some skill to it.
Yeah.
Which leads us to the third program we're going to touch on briefly, which is Indiana during this time, which Tom Crean deserves all the credit in the world for inheriting the mess that he received. Kelvin Sampson is a different coach today than he was 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I think in many respects. And I also think that when that team left Bloomington, when Kelvin left Bloomington, and Dan Dockage came in and kind of kept things at least going for a few weeks. Tom comes in and he basically has to clean house. And, we talked about Calipari in 2009 stepping out there, giving the speech. Crean gave a similar one that was less heralded. But at the same time, he's out there retail politicking. He's out there. He's going to he's going to the barbershop, basically. Yeah. Wherever this guy goes, he's promoting IU basketball. Mm-hmm. And he's doing it on the recruiting trail, too. And so he lands that Watford Holes Creek class, 2009. and then their wins total go from 5 to 10.
Yeah.
They deal with a Creek injury. They get Vic Oladipo and Will Sheehy, who were not top 4-star type recruits. They were kind of in that developmental recruiting.
Yeah, but Oladipo was at least considered high ceiling. I do remember that.
Clearly.
People on the East Coast, were saying it's like, yeah, right now he'd be a really good defensive guy on any D1 team. If he gets a jump shot and a bit of dribbling, he will probably be an NBA player. So,
and he got those things, and then landing Cody Zeller, and so then you see kind of in year 4 the ramp up, the shoot up, beats Kentucky with the Watt shot. Yeah. The next year they're the number 1 overall seed, number 1 AP, number 1. You see the regression, and before we get there, but a lot of this was he's getting players that, unlike Painter, who gets a core and guys that can do 1 or 2 things skilled around them, he's getting the best possible players for what he can get, and players that he can mold and develop.
Yeah.
And when he brought the movement in with Farrell, Hollowell, and Masperea and Jurkin, those 4 guys, and said, okay, we've got this thing rolling. And other than Farrell, that class didn't really pan out.
Yeah.
But he's still, for every James Blackman Jr. and Robert Johnson he's bringing a Jeremiah April and a Tim Priller.
Yeah. A wide variance of capabilities, let's say.
And even though he ramps up and the team wins another Big Ten title in 2016, almost beats UNC that year.
Yeah.
By 2017, they kind of, the writing's on the wall, and he was dismissed at the end of that year.
Yeah.
And so he's running a blended track. So you have, again, a system track by every measurement with Butler and even a VCU and a Wichita State, where you have these coaches who are creating. We have true system players who are coming in.
Yeah.
You have Purdue that's kind of doing a similar thing, but they know they're getting a talented, they can use a talented core. And then you have Indiana going with, okay, we have 2 and dones and guys like Zeller, 1 and 2 and dones with Thomas Bryant.
Yeah.
But what we're really missing, but really we're also kind of filling in. We're trying to create a world where we can have the 3rd recruit and the 300 recruit, and we're going to get them to play together.
Yeah.
And so you can look at most every program in the country, Mike, and I think you could pretty much say everybody was kind of in that meld at that time. Yeah. And those trying to figure out how to blend teams together to get them to win like they are today.
Yeah.
But here were at least multiple programs who could recruit at a high level, and they were doing things a little differently than what we're going to talk about here in segment 3.
Yeah. Yeah. Though it is interesting. Yeah. And I think I always remember, just before we go into segment 3, another little bullet point I remember at the time was noticing that class that was sort of like the hub of that IU team was Watford, Creek, Hulls. Watford was 45, Creek was 58, and Hulls was 74. So again, just another hint about okay, well, where are a lot of these guys falling in terms of the ones that are really either turning programs around or actually significantly contributing towards, national championship caliber rosters.
And you can look at those 3 years of recruiting, those 4 years of recruiting, and know why Indiana was the number 1 team in the country just based on that data.
Yep.
And it was just getting enough. It was just that sustainability piece that how close Indiana was under Tom Crean is unbelievable.
Yeah.
So we'll move on, and after the break, we're gonna go to the programs that were a lot more successful. As Mike's going to walk us through that shift in who was winning and how they were doing it.
All right, welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Mike Wiemuth, my co-host Bob Moats. We're in segment 3. We're going to discuss 2016 and beyond. So we're going to walk through a little bit of what happened at that time period and start to discuss specifically how I arrived at the notion of a sweet spot and some of the models that you'll typically see me post about on on Pigs or social media or elsewhere. So, so if we go back in that time, if you remember, right after Duke won the national championship in 2015, both Kentucky and Duke went on a little bit of a rut in the NCAA tournament. Typically, at that point, Duke and Kentucky were both like, full scale, with both feet in on one and done rosters, or one and done heavy rosters, let me say. And as time was going by, you saw, Duke lost in, the Sweet 16 in 2016, lost to South Carolina in the round of 32 the next year, Kansas, the Elite Eight, Michigan State, the Elite Eight after that. And then on Kentucky's side, of course, they lost IU in 2016, the Sweet 16. 2 years later, they dropped by K-State into the Sweet 16 and lost to Auburn the next year. So basically, these teams were losing to typically more experienced rosters, teams that had like some balance of talent but also experience. So I remember noting at the time, it seemed like there was a divergence was seeming to be coming about in terms of the performance of one and done heavy teams after Kentucky and Duke had both won those early championships. So I started reverse engineering the title teams at that time, and I started to try to contrast them against large cross sections of teams that weren't winning as much, and focusing specifically on like talent, output, experience, to see like, okay, well, why is this, shift happening? What is it looking like? And what is probably the best way to go about building a roster if Duke and Kentucky are no longer, able to hit the same marks as they did in 2012 and 2015. So taking a look at the title game in 2016 is maybe a good starting point. Carolina and Villanova. Just a quick disclaimer. I live very close to Villanova, and I'm a little bit of a Jay Wright devotee. So if you hear me speaking glowingly about Villanova, you'll know that there is some local bias involved in that. So, but I also think he's actually pretty good. So, so you can see in the two roster samples here, Villanova and Carolina both had extensive numbers of top 100 players. You see Jalen Brunson, Daniel Shafu, Ryan Archidiakono, Chris Jenkins, Phil Booth on the Nova side, Justin Jackson, Isaiah Hicks, Marcus Page, Kennedy Meeks, and on down. I think, Villanova had 7, and I believe Carolina had 10 top 100 players within this year's roster. What's most notable about these two is that you don't see a lot of freshmen. Jalen Brunson was a little bit unusual for Villanova in that he got a starting role on that team, which was usually not the typical thing you saw with a Jay Wright, especially a point guard. Mm-hmm. Was not something you typically see Jay Wright just handing point guard responsibilities to a freshman.
Would you say that Jalen Brunson in and of itself was a little unusual across the board, just because how incredibly skilled and talented he was?
Yeah, he was very unusual kid in terms of his. I just watched the NBA today, and he's basically lifting the Knicks to where they are, and also ironically OGM and Anunoby's helping him right along. But the Knicks are basically, I think, like a Villanova alumni group now, because you have Brunson and DiVincenzo, and I think at least and Hart's there too. So it's it's definitely a little bit of a reunion, in the Garden for these Villanova dudes.
So it didn't work out as well for Pitino in the Fleet Center 20 years earlier, I might add. 25 years ago. Yeah. When he tried, and we'll take Antoine Walker and the rest of the guys. We'll try this magic again, see if it works. Exactly.
So and I remember that. I remember at the time when I was observing this, and saying that the 2016 2016 is when IU beat Kentucky in the Sweet 16 game. And then this game happens, 2 weeks later or whatever. I did start trying to track, okay, well, what patterns are we seeing as far as the rankings and all that? And I remember thinking okay, well, the Villanova teams, this one really kind of reminds me a little bit of those Florida and UConn teams of the past. You kind of notice okay, well, say Ochefu and Archidiakono and Jenkins and Booth and those guys. Okay, well, a lot of them, they're not in the top 30. They're kind of clustering around the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s areas. And even on the Carolina side, you saw that a little bit too. You see okay, Page is just, within the 30s, at 28, Johnson, Meeks, James, a lot of those guys. So again, it was, I was just starting to notice that, okay, well, looking back, I'm starting to piece these teams and sort of string them a little bit together and saying, okay, well, that old secondary track, which I had noticed, which was not Duke, Kentucky and Carolina in the past. Maybe this Villanova team is a little bit like those old teams. And maybe this is just the reemergence or sort of the I guess the old secondary track basically trying to take over and become sort of its own primary track. Mm-hmm. And so I was looking at this sample and I was really starting to dig in the numbers even more heavily. And I remember the Carolina team was a little bit unusual in a sense that they were not a one and done program at that time. You remember, right. I believe Roy Williams has only had 7. UNC is not in total only had 7 one and dones in their time compared to again, Duke had 31 or Kentucky had 31 and Duke had 28. And so, so I think last week when I was collecting all this information for this pod, our friend Bo Haynes, he texted me. He said, I watched the last pod and it was interesting. You're talking about, the sweet spot and all that. But what about those Carolina teams? Maybe take a look at them again, because they seem to be a little bit not the one and done Kentucky model, but they're definitely not quite like the sweet spot model either. And so, and I vaguely remember a lot of those Carolina teams were kind of unusual in that they had kids that were in the top 30 during the one and done era that stayed, guys that would, right. Did stay until their juniors and seniors who were ranked 15th. And you see in this sample too, I mean, they have 5 guys in the top 30 that are not freshmen and were significantly contributing to a national championship team. And Bo had said, I think we're going to call that the utopian spot. And yeah, go ahead.
And to throw in on that, it's utopian because if you're looking at this, you're seeing this, that it's just how stacked that UNC team was. Mm-hmm. And to add on to it, they're probably the last. They're the last team we've seen since then that's been as big across the board. That you look at the sizes and the lengths of these players. They had excellent guard play, but you just had more size, 6'7", 6'8", 6'9" at the wings. Yeah. Versus what you're seeing in right now, where you see a lot of teams that are winning with 6'3", 6'4", 6'5", 6'6". Yeah. And they weren't a great shooting team from the perimeter either, if I recall correctly.
What, Carolina?
Yeah.
Yeah, they were on every night except when they played Indiana.
There was that one night where they actually hit threes. And, I remember that night well. So
we all do.
We all do. And so that was – but they were just built differently. And it may be that utopian moment where it's kind of paradise lost at the end, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just it did seem like that was sort of the whole ebbing of the old model. When guys did stay for 4 years who were top end guys, sort of the Hansborough sort of type of players that Carolina always seemed to bring in, which was again differentiated from what Kentucky and Duke were doing at the time. So so Just note on the video, it's at 104:57. Bo, I did actually mention you, and I gave the proper citations, so I don't expect to get any lawyer notes from Louisiana about improper use of of intellectual property. So.
And because we're covering a bar tab, we can't send you any money.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, don't ask for anything, right? For the next week or two. Yeah.
Month.
Yeah. I remember writing at that time, I think I posted something like, on the pages that, it seemed like Jay Wright, Billy Donovan, Jim Calhoun had fashioned what I called an attainable secondary model that didn't require you to jump in against, the Krzyzewskis and Caliparis of the world to try to, grab recruits to, build a championship roster. So I think I actually said at the time, it's like, you need to get near elite players to compete for titles as a minimum. You don't necessarily need the elite. And as that split was going, I remember like after Nova won that second title in 2008, while the rest of the one and done programs, again, were continuing to fail in the NCAA tournament and underperform. That was, I guess, would have been like April 2018. I first posted the idea of the sweet spot. It was the idea that there is this sort of like secondary alternative that basically falls in between both the one and done model of programs and basically just everyone else, just like 95% of other college programs that can't get good enough recruits and just have to settle for what they got. So yeah, I remember I had to show in numbers like what I was actually doing and like what how this actually presented itself. So I've spent a lot of time in that time period running through metrics around like performance based upon rankings, again, because I did start to really make that differentiation in the rankings at that time, because I was noticing that looking at a lot of the rosters that were competing for championships, you notice a lot of kids, again, from the 30s, 40s, 50s into the 80s, but it kind of like tapered off once you get into past the 80s and 90s into the hundreds. You just saw like a steep decline in the number of guys that were competing on national championship teams ranked in like the hundreds, 125s, 150s, and so on. On this other end, I saw that the rate of kids leaving early really seemed to taper off around the 30s. And so I figured like, okay, maybe just like identifying and sort of solidifying a zone that differentiates, this sort of like middle area between the one and dones and the everyone else. So that's when I first, kind of placed sort of these guideposts at 3380 as, just a starting point. Again, it doesn't mean that when a kid's rated 29 that, it's impossible for them to be a sweet spot kid, or if they're rated 80, 81 or above. Again, when I talk about the rankings in terms of using these ranges, it's really about concentrations versus like guarantees. The sweet spot kids that, I've heard other people say, well, that, the sweet spot is 30 through 80. It's not technically exactly right. It's 30 through 80 is where you find the most sweet spot players. But it's not exclusive to them. You can find sweet spot players just about anywhere, but generally speaking, if you're trying to target players that are most likely to compete for national championships, that zone is really where you need to be shooting. And I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about, right up here. So yeah, I first jumped into the 2016 recruiting class and started to do some data polls on performance. And the first thing I looked at was the box plus minus, the peak scores. And if you remember from episode 3, we talked about box plus minus. It's basically just it's an output measure of points scored above the average player over the course of 100 possessions. So
it measures offense and defense.
Yes, right? It is a cumulative between offense and defense. So it is a total measure of performance for players. Exactly. And
Can you go through the ranges real quick on that? Like what 0 represents, and then
yeah, exactly. I mean, 0 is basically the absolute middle average player in college basketball. So if you take all the college basketball players, you put them into a bucket, and 0 will be the theoretically like the middle performing player. So the measure is basically above and below that player. And so typically, if you have a rating, let's say of like 1, 2, or 3, typically that's like a decent, solid, but not great basketball player. Obviously, you start to become a good, actually influential player once you get to like 4 and 5. And by the time you get up to like, 7, 8, 9, now you're getting into like real nationally competitive players. And you get towards like, 10 and above, you're talking about like, all-American, type candidates. So that's kind of giving a sense of the scale of like, what we're referring to.
So as we're going through this, and, for those listening, the 1 through 30s are at 7.15, 6.71, 31 through 80. So they're almost equal. And then that almost a 4 on that 81 to 200. Those 81 to 200s are still good players.
Yeah, exactly.
What we're talking about, though, are players who are what you would look for in a national championship roster.
Mm-hmm.
So for like, if I'm sitting at Minnesota and I get a bunch of 100 guys and they're at BPMs of, ranging from 2 to 7, I might be feeling like that's maybe one of our better seasons we've had in the last 20 years, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you, any player over 0 is technically, above average, in terms of all of college basketball. I mean, it's like, even down into like the lower conferences. But yeah, what we're discussing here is just like,
national,
like the scope of national championship, level competition.
I think the reason I'm asking this is because I think sometimes when you and I both interact with fans, it's this sort of thing of all or nothing. It's a follow the shoe, follow the gourd again.
Yeah.
Where if you're not getting these guys, you're going to be like sub 500 and the program's going to fall apart in front of you.
Yeah.
When in reality, sometimes those are the guys in those kind of regression years a couple times that pull you into the tournament.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And even with, I mean, again, these are averages. When we're talking about this scale here, is, the 1 through 30s again. Yeah. They're up at 7.15. That's, those are obviously very elite scores. The 30 through 80s are like at 6.71, just barely behind them. And the 81 through 200s, they're down at 3.93. So there's obviously a very like steep differentiation between like the 80s to 200s versus the 30s through 80s. Yeah, there are great players in this range. In this 2016 sample I drew, in the sub 80s, Carson Edwards is part of that far right bar. Grant Williams from Tennessee is also in there. So if you dip down to any recruiting class list, you will find every year there's going to be like 2 or 3 kids that are just absolutely awesome players that will like be playing in the NBA and having a big contribution and possibly being like all-American candidates in college basketball. The problem is it's just, again, it's a concentration issue. There's just more concentration of better players numerically in these upper echelons than what you find down there. So like you said, Bob, it's like typically like fans will say, well, what about this one player? Mm-hmm. This one player wasn't ranked up there. How could you, say that, you shouldn't be recruiting in there? We never say that you shouldn't recruit like below that scale. Frankly, even if you're doing your best job recruiting, you're probably going to have to take at least like 3 or 4 sub 100 players, even if you're at your best, because you just can't have a roster full of like, top 100 players anymore. That's just almost impossible. But from a probability standpoint, what we're talking about again is just like the performance measure of getting enough players that you actually start to look like a national championship roster. And obviously there's big advantages to taking these upper end kids versus the kids at the lower end. Mm-hmm. So yeah, in this measure also, I use peak average, which means that that's like the top BPM score for players who achieved that in their best year of their career. So again, this is not like the average over the total of their career, just like the number one best score they had. If they had a great senior year, okay, I took their senior year score. They had a good junior, the best was their junior year, I took their best junior year score. This is a little bit easier to do because if you do averages, it actually makes the scale even tip a little bit more against like the sub 100, sub 80 kids, because a lot of them were actually like negative BPM. So I try to create a scale that at least gives some sense of, okay, this is where these kids are ending up. Not as, because again, a lot of kids won't even be playing much when they're starting out. So I want to give a sense of like the development of where these guys were kind of topping out at. If we go to the next, looking forward into the this next slide. So if you think about like what we just talked about, the range of, like national championship starter averages, what we'd said before is oftentimes around 7 to 9 range collectively. So like sub 80s, again, they're kind of way below the scale at, 3.9. So they're kind of way off the pace of what you would need to participate on a national championship roster. So that's sort of the strike against like the sub 80 recruits. On the flip side is the experience question. So this is a 2016 recruiting class by their seniority. Basically, did they make it to their junior senior year? And in this scale, you see that the 1 through 30s only made it to their junior senior year 20% of the time. So only 1 in 5 players made it. That means 80% of those players were jumping out early. And with the one and done, obviously, is one and done rule having a big role in that. The 30 through 80 kids were staying until their last 2 years, 78% of the time. And then the 80s to, up to the 200s were at 82%. So
we pretty much have an 80-20 rule here in practice.
Yeah, a little bit of Pareto distribution. Exactly. And also if you look at the scale, if you look at the numbers through time, you'll typically see like, this like reappearing on different studies that I've done. So yeah, this is held constant pretty well. The 1 through 30 number changes kind of rapidly sometimes. I mean, it's kind of like, waved a lot depending upon like what NBA GMs are doing at the time.
And what's in the class. I mean, you may not have, or what's on the international scene. I mean, you're talking, there are 64 draft spots or 32 NBA teams, 64 spots, not everybody, and you're talking 30 players. All of these guys who are going one and done, I think, are expecting to be drafted.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's it's crazy. What the number I was looking at the other day is that just the number of players that used to be drafted back in like 2009 versus today is like quadrupled. So it used to be like, just like a handful. It was like, 5 or 6, and now it's up to like, 20 plus, every year of one and done. So again, that's a big part of like, why you're seeing this like distortion taking place. Because over the course of like time, if like you're taking out an extra, dozen and a half players than you were, let's say 10 years ago, over the course of 4 years, that's an extra what, 3 or 4 dozen players that they're not going to be making it to their, junior, senior year. So, So again, like this whole like supply and demand of like players at these different tranches is kind of making itself appear in the tournament like that.
And you also, again, even with the one and done, you have kids like Blake Wesley who was a one and done. Also, Trae Young, who's probably the best example of someone who was further down the rankings.
Yeah.
So you get that variance too, but those are more exceptional than they are by rule.
Exactly. Yeah, but if we look at the impact here on the like why this is a problem, let's say for teams recruiting heavily in one and done area, this slide here indicates the 2017 to 2023 national title starters and the percentages that they had on their squad in terms of their junior and senior year participation. And in this, you see that basically all the teams are at least above 60%. Again, looking back in the one and done slide, you saw that it was just 20%. So at a minimum, the teams that are winning a national championship are 3 to 4 times more likely to have players that are staying until their junior, senior year. So that's a huge distortion between title winning teams and sort of like the one and done pool.
And I just want to throw in real quick that
Sure.
when you start talking about NCAA teams that are winning national championships, you look at minutes distribution by the time you get to the final game, and I can't really think of a time where the bench was really being utilized at a really high level. You may get one player here or there, but you're running your 5 starters 30 minutes plus more times than not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's also just like, the advantages to seniority. I mean, aside from just like the physicality part of it, obviously, just like the mental facet of it is that they're just more poised. Oftentimes, they're more experienced, and why you saw so many times in those late tournament teams with Duke, with Kentucky, failing against teams that again had just as much maybe physicality, weren't as maybe as skilled, but we're able to sort of like D them up with more experienced and at least within the same neighborhood of athleticism as some of those teams. Better
connected, more exactly. Things at the table. The nuances of reads are easier when you play with guys for a couple 3 years. Goes back to the international question where it's like you throw a bunch of NBA guys out there versus a bunch of international guys. That international team may have played together a lot longer.
Exactly.
And so that's one of those issues that you run into that we've seen over the last, really since the 70s.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so if you think in terms of the numbers, like the 70% of the title-winning starters are staying until their junior and senior year. And that's a near perfect match to the 78% of the 30 through 80 range kids that were staying until their junior, senior year. So you see this like mismatch developing. The top 30 kids are out of step with winning titles due to a huge experience gap. And then the sub 80 kids are likewise out of step due to a talent performance gap. But the 30 through 80 kids are a near match statistically for what you see on national championship rosters. And then when you actually go through the actual list of players, just go on like sportsreference.com, check out the national championship winning teams and just look at, the roster, and you can see like their RSCI number, their ranking, and you see how many times you'll notice that, okay, there's a kid that's rated 40, there's a kid that's rated 60. You'll just see this like pattern develop. Especially after you get, into the last 10 years or so, the teams that are winning championships are just loaded up with these middle range kids. Yeah. Individual level, that's, what we're showing you here is just like, what it looks like just as an individual player. It's basically the same thing you see with a team. We used a similar slide back in our last episode, but this is Jared Butler. He's, I guess you would say, kind of a representative example of a sweet spot kid. He's, kind of rated around the 80s, 90s area. He was on the Baylor's championship team in 2021. In this sample, you see the first year starting point. Against the one and done average, he is below theirs. He's at about like a 3.9. The one and done BPM average is typically around just above 6. So I think it's like 6.15. And then the sub 100s, typically you'll see them down at like, 0, 1, or 2. And so you see the sweet spot kids are above the 100 kids as a freshman, but they're still below the one and done kids in terms of their output performance as freshmen. But the advantage obviously is that as time goes by, the one and done kids leave. Their development stops in college because they're only there for a year. Their development continues in the NBA. The sweet spot kids, their development still happens at their school. And because of just the typical slope of basketball development for players from freshman to sophomore, especially, but as sophomore to junior and so on. The talent advantage of the one and done top 30 type kids is basically overmatched by the experience advantage of players ranked just that one step below them. A kid ranked in the 30 through 80s on average will generally be a greater benefit to NCAA title winning than a top 30 kid, top 30 one and done type kid, due to that maturity advantage. Again, the one and done players, the top 30, they will typically over the course of their career be better basketball players. But again, they're being better basketball players in the NBA, and they're not staying around long enough to actually become the kind of players you see typically on national championship teams. The sub 100s, again, just for the most part, with few exceptions, just can't quite get up to the performance level of those sweet spot kids because, just of the talent disparity, despite staying just as long, if not longer, than some of the sweet spot kids.
As we're looking at, and again, as we're kind of going through this whole process, it kind of reminds me as well that when you start talking about those 8, those juniors and how many of them also after a national, like Adama Sanango comes to mind last year for UConn, jumping to the draft.
Yeah.
And right now also, one thing that we're going to be looking at also, I know Mike's definitely in this, I think about it a lot, how this COVID year is impacting the junior year.
Oh, yeah.
Where you have now super seniors for the first time in college basketball. And a year from now, things could be maybe not, they could be a little or a lot different depending on those guys matriculating out. Like that Galloway Leal class that's going through right now, the Zach Edey class, the question is what happens to them after this year going into next?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, it's like it has thrown like this huge, weird air bubble into the normal process of players coming in and going, but also just their development and teams sort of like having some reliability in their staffing.
Right. Well, and I mean, from a developmental standpoint, some of these teams and programs some of these players lost almost not a year, but they lost a significant portion of travel ball time.
Yeah.
As we're going through this group here. So the question about talent regression is throughout the game. Trust me when we're talking about 5th, 6th, and 7th graders, we're seeing some differences, some stuff that's just not like 5 years ago. I've got kids who are good still, but they're not as game experienced and maybe not as complete as they were when I was working with 5 seasons ago. Yeah. So we're all having to adjust at every level of the game.
Exactly. Yep. No, it's it's going to be interesting. I'm kind of looking forward to the COVID bubble, finally bursting and getting back to some degree of normalcy in our in our classes.
And then we're going to start talking about NIL and the portal. It's like, okay.
Well, yeah, we can only manage so many of these like these dramatic variables at once. So yeah, I'm looking forward to COVID bubble ending.
Yeah, ending.
Exactly. Yeah, so we look on some of these last slides. When you plot these on like an XY axis of box plus minus average and the experience of the players, you'll start to see like this this pattern develop where the one and dones and the sort of like everybody else bucket are clearly differentiated in terms of like where they're ending up on this graph. And I've always compared this to like a bowling alley, because like one day when I actually was putting this stuff up, I was approaching the table at like a 45-degree angle from the chart, and I noticed like looking from like the bottom left-hand corner straight up to the top right, I noticed that the pattern was that like if you saw the sweet spot, again as the sort of top right hand target, on the left hand side and the right hand side, you basically had the two gutters, let's say. Mm-hmm. And the left gutter you could say is like the one and done kids, or the top 30 kids that don't stay very long. these are the kids that obviously are very talented, but they lack experience. And you see, like, again, their box plus minuses are like way spiked up, way above sort of like the everybody else bucket. But, they're like, 8s, 9s, 7s, 6s, depending upon, like where they, sort of like, depending on the year and like the, like the circumstance. So like Anthony Davis, again, like the reason Kentucky won that championship, Anthony Davis was like so unusual compared to all the other one and dones. He was like a 17. Whereas I said before, like, a lot of the other kids are, much lower down, like, 6, 7,
like
8s.
Okafor, same thing, right? I mean,
Okafor, Winslow, and who was there? I think it was like Cook, maybe. They were all 10 plus. They were all averaged 10 plus. I remember that was sort of like the statistical outlier with that group is that their 3 one and dones averaged above 10, which is really good. So and unfortunately, I think for Kentucky and Duke, like that. Once you get like a class like that, you almost feel like you're like you're Captain Ahab, chasing the whale, for the rest of your career, trying to like recreate that, same class. And unfortunately, those kids are not as often, showing up, but on the recruiting classes every year.
And just put it this way, like again, how many guys playing in the NBA? How many guys make it to the Hall of Fame?
Yeah,
I mean we tend to kind of look at this from a standpoint, again, all or nothing at all, but there's varying degrees across the board. And the one and dones fit that as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm thinking of the left gutter, right gutter, bowling alley analogy here. The sweet spot obviously is kind of where the head pin, where you're shooting for. And if you were, just to prove that we're not lying, if you were to do this yourself and started plotting this stuff out and using actual starting, let's say like starting 5 average examples of box plus minus, basically the starting 5 averaging up all their box plus minuses, coming up with a score. This is what you see. Again, this looks pretty much exactly like what you saw on the previous slide. Basically, the top left-hand side, the one and dones, the bottom right-hand side, the right gutter, everyone else, and sort of like right smack in between them, up the top right-hand corner is the sweet spot. And you see with the sweet spot, the kind of teams you see up there, these are some of the most recent national champions: Baylor, Nova, Carolina, Kansas, Virginia, UConn. The one and done column you see over, again, separated from where they are in terms of experience, Duke, UK, and some of their most recent teams. And everybody else, I threw in like a sample of like a lot of the Big Ten teams from last year. You see like Michigan, Northwestern, IU, who are, again, as experienced as the sweet spot guys, but they're below them on the performance scale relative to the champions.
It's funny when you look at this, because I'm looking at these Big Ten teams going, and you look at teams that are talking that 81 to 200, and you look at where those teams are in this, and they're pretty much right there where they should be. If that I mean, when you talk about the Wisconsins, the Northwesterns, the Iowas, those teams are not at, I mean, they're because of, it kind of just, again, fits the formula perfectly that, your team, where that average BPM might be sitting around 4, and you got a bunch of 150 guys on your team.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and it's, it is interesting. I remember when I first started running this data, just thinking like, okay, well, I jumped online and sort of like shared it with everyone. And but I remember specifically, like I had sort of like, I guess I had like 2 thoughts specifically, like with Kentucky, like, my analytical side was like, this is really bad for Kentucky, and they should stop what they're doing right away. Then my IU fan side was like, this is fantastic. I hope this never comes to an end.
Keep doing it.
Yeah.
When your opponent is drowning, throw them an anchor.
Yeah, it was the Carville's line.
Yeah,
exactly.
The James Carville line. Yeah. Throw them an anchor.
Throw them an anchor. Yeah. That I was actually like years ago. I was like thinking maybe I should go on Rupp Rafters under like an assumed name and just like encourage it, saying, guys, I've done this amazing research, on like the one and dones, and what Calipari is doing is like absolutely amazing. We should not only should we not like, stop doing it. I think we should just go ahead and have like a full, Logan's Run version of roster construction. Just like as soon as you get done with your freshman year, I'm sorry, son, we don't allow sophomores at Kentucky. So please step into the portal on the right.
If you can buy a case of beer, you're no longer allowed at the University of Kentucky. Go hit the portal.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and I'm sort of looking forward to. I was like plotting these every year, and so I just keep like adding more and more. But yeah, it's just interesting that it's been kind of pretty consistent. Like you just have these 3 plots. I mean, obviously there are teams that sort of like come in the middle, but if we're talking about like a heat map, this pattern is pretty much what you'll see, either like looking back and compared to like what you see in like the roster rankings and things like that.
And again, the asterisk on all this is something weird can always happen.
Yeah.
When we talked about UK, being differently built this year, and if they can find a way to win 6 games, or what if Florida Atlantic hits an extra shot, sort of thing. Something out there can happen, just kind of like the long shot horse wins the Kentucky Derby. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and it's that's what I say about like this kind of work is that there's no consistency to it over time. I mean, like I always say that all these things that I find that I study, it's like, okay, you've got like 10 years of whatever this is. It'll be like this for a period of time, but then, the next wave is coming and it's going to like, turn your analysis around. So now you're pointed this way and you have to start like analyzing, these variables instead of the ones you used to.
And we have to sometimes not focus too much on the bright, shiny object because you're talking in 10 years, you're talking 40 Final Four teams. Some weird stuff's going to happen.
Yeah.
And it has. And the point is you just can't look at the bright, shiny object, see it as a trend. Now you can look at it and say, how did that happen?
Yeah.
And you can look at a Shaka Smart like we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Or you can look at what Dusty May did at Florida Atlantic when the bracket breaks. And that's just a tournament. We're not even talking about the weirdness that happens during a regular season or when you have Evansville going into Rupp Arena and beating a University of Kentucky one-and-done team.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
That stuff just happens.
Yep. Yeah, sometimes, Dusty, Shaka, and all those guys, it's those Battle of Agincourt coaches beating the Verdun coaches.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and this Final slide sample. I try to sort of like measure looking now and looking back in terms of the participation of top 30 players on title rosters. And so again, going back to those times where we're talking about around before 2016, this sample is 2009, 2012. The 4 national championship teams starters during that period, 16 of the 20 starters were top 30 rated players. So you like from the Carolina, Duke, UConn, and Kentucky teams. You see like Hansborough, Shire, Singler, Walker, Araki, and then all the Kentucky kids from the 12 squad. So again, 80%. If you think about this as like a sort of barrier to entry, like, where are you having to get your players to win national championships? You look at this, it tells you, man, if I'm not getting a majority of kids in the top 30, I'm kind of screwed. Now, if you go forward to today and where we sit now, the top 30 rated starters on title squads from 2019 to 2023 is now 0. So in that time period, what we're talking about before, there's literally like a 180 that is, taken place, by the basketball gods saying, okay, before you had to have these top 30 kids to even have a chance to compete for a national championship. Now, not only do you not need to get them, there may actually be a penalty for taking too many of those kids. And that's again where we talk about, the influence of the one and dones, teams taking on too many kids that don't have quite the right balance of experience and talent. And those upper tier squads really suffering again in the tournament against those teams that do have a little bit better balance in terms of the talent and maturity.
So, in other words, if Dean Wormer's looking at this and looks at Plutarski, he says 0.0. and I'm just thinking about looking at Flounder and saying, inexperienced and talented is no way to go through life, son.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, let's maybe reevaluate it. But again, it just shows how dynamic this is, shows how much things have changed, and it also shows how other programs have innovated their way through this, through recruiting, through development, through whether it's system, whatever they're doing, getting kids to stick, basically getting riding that line of the highest level of talent you can ride with staying the longest period of time.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. And when we come back, we will we'll go ahead and shut this conversation down and talk about our next episode here on X's and Joe's. All right. Welcome back. Bob, any final thoughts?
Going to be great to see you again. I would just caution everybody again, looking at this, come to your own conclusions, obviously. I think it's incredibly hard to look at this and not come to some conclusions, but at the same time, it's important to realize that you can also be successful and be good at and again, with the portal, especially the one team, can teams be melded together pretty quickly? It's going to be something we're going to be watching very closely. So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, the one question I probably get most asked about, like this notion of the sweet spot, what teams should be doing in terms of building championships. Probably the one big the one big dragon that's like sweeping across the plain to destroy all this research is going to probably be the portal. And in terms of, I won't say like destroy the research, but I would say maybe it's going to become a second large tributary into the pool of what we consider the sweet spot. Again, the sweet spot is not like a fixed entity. It's like, again, it's ever evolving, and it's going to be, I would say that I could see the portal players in 5 years. I'll make this prediction now. In 5 years, we'll be having a sweet spot conversation, and the overwhelming majority of players that will be in this national championship conversation might be portals.
And I think it also goes to, you think about the 30 through 80s and the dilemma that they're going to be going through of, do I wait my turn maybe in a high major contending program? Or do I try a different, maybe I go to a mid-major? And that's my kind of thought here and maybe try to just test my chops so I can at least keep playing, and then I can transfer into a program that's more my fit, if that makes sense. Now, NIL factors into this as well, because if you're getting paid a nice NIL package to kind of sit the bench and learn the game, you might be more apt to want to stay at one of those high major programs.
Yeah.
But the other question is, then how it's gonna require coaches who know how to manage players well.
Yeah,
guys like Mike Woodson, guys like Matt Painter, both know how to do that in different ways. I think the days of coaches just looking at a kid and saying, "You're mine," sit, you're gonna, I think that the massaging is going to be different. And I also think that for families, for agents now more and more. Personal trainers, AAU coaches, the networks in and around kids, the expectations are going to have to be a thing of we need to probably manage that a little differently. Yeah. And maybe it does come down to, if you think, well, again, let's look at Blake Wesley as a great example of this. He picks Notre Dame. Notre Dame picks him. He goes one and done.
Yeah.
It was a good fit for him. So on that note, we'll look forward to seeing hopefully a few of you this weekend
Yeah, absolutely. Don't order too much on the bar tab that we're apparently being asked to set up.
Hey, listen, I'd love to be able to wear a false mustache, but I'm already kind of screwed. So
We'll get you a wig. Don't worry, Bob.
I got that Les Nessman pulling up the curl. I mean, I just see it going. So, again, special thank you to Bob Thompson for the music and sounds that you hear on this show, and John Ringer of Ring Design, that's 2gs.com, for designing the logo and the artwork that you see.
Great. Yeah, in our next episode coming up probably about 2 weeks, Bob and I will be discussing rivalries, where they come from, how they operate, and what makes them so much fun in college basketball. So this endless conversation was brought to you by the Back Home Network. Be sure to check out all the great BHN content, including Assembly Call, Doing the Work, and Crimson Cast on YouTube and at backhome.network.com. Until next time, I'm Mike Wiemuth.
And I'm Bob Moats.
Have a good one, everyone. Take care.
Happy Groundhog Day.